evening. I want to tell you this evening about some mistakes that I've made in code and in life, and what I am learning from those mistakes. So, a couple of years ago, I lost my dreams and I lost my faith. Let's talk about dreams. I was someone who, from a very young age, had a really good idea of what was the correct life for me to have. I had an idea of the life that I wanted to arrive at. And so, from the age of 18 onward, I set myself single-mindedly towards achieving that life, arriving at that life. I became something like a function bent on arriving at a return value. And I was ticking off the steps towards arriving at this place. Get married, have kids, level up my career, level up my reputation so that I can level up my career more. And along the way, other things just kind of fell by the wayside. Hobbies, friendships, enjoying life in the moment. Like I said, I was single-minded. I was a function. And at the age of 35, I achieved this goal. I arrived where I wanted to be. I had a big family. I had a big house in the woods, in the mountains. I was working from home, surrounded by my family. I was done. And I got to enjoy this afterlife for about 2 years. And then a surprise happened. My marriage unexpectedly fell apart, and I found myself alone in that big house in the woods, reconsidering just about everything about how I had lived my life up to that point. Now, at the same time, I was also losing my faith. And when I say my faith, I mean my faith in the most dominant religion of our time, object-oriented programming. Over the course of my career, I had learned a lot about object-oriented programming, and then I'd had to unlearn most of it. And eventually, I arrived at the writings of Alan Kay, who created object-oriented programming. And I learned from him that OO was really just supposed to be about messaging, about the encapsulation of state process, and about the extreme late binding of all things. And he said that of all these, messaging was the most important part. As a matter of fact, he even regretted calling it object-oriented programming because it put the focus on the wrong part. And so once I learned this, I tried to focus on just applying this simple idea of messaging to writing code and to all my designs. I tried to apply it. I tried to teach OO in the form of just sending messages. But something never quite felt right about this. Because the more I tried to think and code in a message-oriented way, the more it started to feel like cognitive dissonance. You know, when I look at sending a real message, like a message in the mail, what do we put into that? Well, we put just as much information, we copy just as much information into that message as the recipient needs. But in an OO message, we send a reference, and they can reach back through that reference and get anything they want. In the real world, when we send a message and it can't find its recipient, or it does reach its recipient, but they don't understand it, nothing happens to the sender. But in these OO languages, when that happens, what happens? Exception. The sender blows up. Most importantly, when I send a message in the mail, I don't have to freeze at the mailbox until the sender receives the message and processes it and gets back to me. But that's exactly what happens in all of these OO languages. And I realized there was this cognitive dissonance going on. Now, a lot of people, will tell you that the original sin of object-oriented programming is mutable state. I disagree. I believe that the original sin of object-oriented programming is return values, retained from the procedural languages that came before them. Return values are a fundamental denial of the messaging model. And as a matter of fact, if you look at some of Alan Kay's writings, he says that Smalltalk, the language that they had created at Xerox PARC to embody the OO ideal, never quite got there. And everything after that, including every language, every OO language, which they were all inspired by Smalltalk, everything after that kind of took a step backwards. So here's the big lie of object-oriented programming for the past 40 years. We keep saying we're sending messages, and we keep trying to think in terms of sending messages, but we're not. It is really the same call and return semantics that we've seen in every other programming language since before OO. So, I had lost my dreams, and I was losing my faith. And as I reflected on these two things, I realized that they had something in common. I realized that both of these stem from viewing the world in terms of goal-obsessed, uninterrupted, blocking functions from input to output. In other words, transactions. And I've come to call this the transactional fallacy. The transactional fallacy occurs every time somebody models a process as if it were a transaction. And this happens everywhere in software. It is pervasive. Every time your program freezes up while it's processing a whole bunch of data, and you realize that even to show up an updating status while it's doing that, you would have to significantly rewrite it. That's the transactional fallacy. Every time you have a bunch of simple stateless services, and you've got a workflow that starts out hitting just one of those services, it's just got one request in it, but then later on that workflow grows to encompass several services, several requests in a sequence, and you find yourself looking for a way to sneak bundles of intermediate data from one service to the next. That's the transactional fallacy, modeling a process as if it were a transaction. I see this all the time with forms. Forms are a way we try to force communication into the transactional mold, but communication is a process too. Every time I have to take one of my kids to a new doctor, I have to spend 15 minutes filling out intake paperwork. You may not have to deal with that here in Sweden, I don't know, but in the States, it's a huge problem. I hate it. But at least I know that if I set that clipboard down, it's not going to reset itself. At least I know that I can keep filling that form out while they take my kid back to the examination room, and I can keep filling it out asynchronously. At least I know that if I leave some of those fields blank and they really need to know, they can get back to me later and ask me. I shudder to think what the intake process would look like if it were designed by a programmer. Now, the transactional fallacy has a universal symbol, and you are probably already familiar with it, even if you don't realize it. That symbol is the spinning beach ball of death. This is the universal symbol that a programmer expected something to either finish or fail more or less instantaneously, and it did neither of those things. So what is the alternative? Well, we can look to Alan Kay for a clue. When he was explaining OO, he said, I thought of objects being like biological cells or individual computers on a network, only able to communicate with messages. Does this sound like a transactional system? Hardly. As a matter of fact, when you dig into the history of Smalltalk and you look at some of the earlier systems, you find hints of something very different. This is a snippet of code from Smalltalk 72. This class is also a function. And it is a function over a stream of messages that it's pattern matching on. And it's deciding what to do with each of those messages based on the pattern match. One thing it's allowed to do is nothing at all. Now, this might be ringing a bell for some of you, because if you squint, it looks a little like Erlang or Elixir processes pattern matching on messages. And as you may know, if you recognize this, Erlang is built on processes, not objects. This is what I've come to realize. You can't have message-oriented programming unless your objects are more like independent, active processes, like actors. When Alan Kay was talking about message-oriented programming, he was implying objects as processes. And so much of what we model in software turns out to actually be processes. And then we arbitrarily slice across these processes to slice the system into objects. And we wonder why our systems are so hard to understand. What if we stopped focusing on the structure and started looking for the processes? What if we started explicitly modeling these workflows? This is the space that I've started to explore. But in the process, I realized one problem is that the word process is too ambiguous. The word process is way too overloaded. We already use it to mean lots of things. And so I've started to use the term narrative instead. And from here on out, I'm going to use the word narrative. And the more we look at the world, the more we realize it's narratives all the way down. The project that you're working on right now is a narrative. Your software team is a narrative. Your own cells are constantly dying and being replaced, but you still have a coherent identity. It's not so much that you are a person as that you are constantly personing. You are a living narrative. And so it's not just about code. And I believe that our perspectives on the world are reflected into our work. And I believe it goes the other way as well. I think our work, in turn, changes how we perceive the world. Because you can't do something 8 hours a day without it influencing the way you approach life, and vice versa. And so with that in mind, I want to talk to you about what it looks like to think from a narrative perspective, to look at the world from a narrative perspective. But I'm mostly going to talk about this in terms of how I am learning to live my life now. With maybe, along the way, maybe a few hints about how this might apply to code. So first off, a narrative has a direction, not a goal. As I've started to leave goal-oriented life behind, I've found it helpful to have kind of certain images to pull towards that are both very concrete but also a little bit fanciful. My friend Artie Starr calls this having an arrow, something that gives you direction. Let me give you an example of an arrow. One of my arrows is my beer list. Now, this is not a list of beers. It is a list of people that I would like to have a beer with someday. For instance, I would love to have a beer with Adam Savage someday. This is the guy that used to be on Mythbusters. He's just a fascinating person. But here's the thing. The beer list isn't about like, oh, I hope I'm like happen to be at an airport bar with Adam Savage someday. No. The beer list says, what kind of person do I need to become the kind of person for whom it would make sense to have a beer with Adam Savage someday? What kind of impact do I need to have on the world to be in those kinds of circles? It's a list about who I'm becoming. And it gives me a kind of heuristic. Does this choice that's in front of me, does it take me closer to being the kind of person who would meet these people or not? What might it mean for code to have direction rather than a goal? Well, it could mean embracing the actor model, like in Erlang and Elixir. It could mean acknowledging that all or nothing thinking is not good enough. We need feedback earlier, and so we need to look at ways of breaking it down into batching and streaming models. Now, having a direction implies that a narrative is constantly becoming. And becoming requires being aware of where and how I am now, which means a narrative needs to be aware of itself. It needs to be self-aware. In learning how to be more self-aware, we all have a teacher that stands ready to help us as soon as we ask. That teacher is our bodies. The best teacher we could possibly have for embracing the narrative of life. Because your body is never static. Your body has no ideal end state. Your body is constantly dying and replacing itself. It is a narrative. And your body, it interrupts you in the midst of trying to arrive at that return value with little reminders of life, like, I'm sleepy, I'm hungry, I'm cold. You know, I think as programmers, we tend to try to be brains in jars. Because we get this idea that we can divorce the ideas in our heads from the rest of our bodies. Learning to embrace narrative as a person means acknowledging that you are an embodied mammal. It means learning to live in your body. And this can mean something as simple as taking up a mindfulness practice or yoga. It can mean running or hiking or lifting. But as you do these activities, be careful. Because we hackers are so addicted to being brains in jars that even in the midst of one of these activities, we'll start going over to our analytical brains again. Because we measure and we quantify our activities instead of being in them. And in case it's not clear, what I'm saying here is throw away your Fitbit. Learn to feel when you need to take more steps. Learn to feel your target heart rate. Learn to feel when you're dehydrated. Excuse me. What might it mean for code to be self-aware and embodied? Well, it could mean building observability in first instead of leaving it as an afterthought. It could mean making our algorithms so that they can tell the story of their results and the provenance of the data. This might help us out with algorithmic bias as well. So knowing where you are and where you're going means you also know where you've been. Embracing narrative means embracing history and state. I realize embracing state isn't always a popular suggestion, but state is simply the acknowledgement of the passage of time. It is the acknowledgement that everything we want to accomplish that is of worth in code involves the passage of time. It's the acknowledgement that any narrative in the world, whether it's a workflow or a human being, is an accumulation of events and their lasting effects. And we love the idea of a clean reset. But embracing state, embracing narrative means accepting history and that there are no clean slates. What might it mean to embrace state and history in code? Well, this is a big topic, but I'll give you some pointers for your own research. It might mean looking into temporal modeling, which is the practice of modeling systems in terms of events first, rather than structure first. Could mean looking into the event sourcing architecture. Or event storming, which is a practice of discovering the events in your business domain before you look for the business entities. Acknowledging history means embracing entropy. And that means embracing failure. But in a narrative, we look for ways to fail forwards instead of catastrophically, because we realize there will always be surprises. Sometimes a scorpion just falls off the ceiling and lands on your monitor. Totally hypothetical example. Now, what is the standard way in a modern object-oriented language to handle a surprise such as this? We throw an exception, right? In the process, we throw away all of our state, all of our local variables, instance variables, closed down network and database connections. We throw away everything that might help us understand why it happened. You know, something I've noticed is that the more and more focused we are on preventing failure, the more catastrophic the failures tend to be when they finally arrive. The narrative perspective says we need to be less focused on preventing failure and more on how we adapt and keep going. And part of this means being okay with being not okay instead of burning the whole house down. It means learning to sit and work skillfully with suffering and failure. And I've done a lot of that in the last couple of years. What might this mean for code? Well, as an example, it might mean something like the saga pattern, where instead of trying to prevent failure, we prepare compensating actions beforehand that can compensate for those failures when they occur. It could mean spending more time on planning mitigation and remediation than we spend on trying to achieve correctness. The resilience engineering community has started a wonderful conversation about this in our industry. And one of the things that they will tell you about building resilience is that you cannot build resilience into code. You can only build resilience into the socio-technical system that surrounds code. Now, learning to be okay in a failed state means embracing interdependence. When my transactional life raised an exception and came crashing down, I discovered something. I had lots of friends online, but I had nobody nearby. I had completely failed to build a local tribe. You know, I asked around about this a little bit, and over 1,000 people responded on Twitter, and the vast majority of them felt that they did not have an adequate local support system. I think this is an epidemic problem among programmers, because part of being a brain in a jar is that we find it very easy to content ourselves with online relationships. Because it's not a big leap between believing we can divorce our ideas from the rest of ourselves to believing that typing text to a friend online is just as good as going in to get a beer with them. Which it is, until it isn't. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, if you're in that category of that Twitter poll, I just want to encourage you to prioritize making those local friendships. Do it now before something catastrophic happens. And if you're not sure how to get started, come talk to me. I would love to help. What might interdependence mean in code? Well, we have a lot of patterns for this, things like back pressure and back-off algorithms and circuit breakers. And the thing that all these have in common is that they're all acknowledgments that a component is not a black box. It exists in a community of other components. And all these patterns, they involve holding state for the other components, keeping track of how the other components are doing. In other words, all these are patterns that are a rudimentary form of empathy in code. So, these are some of the values of the narrative perspective that I'm exploring. Transactions, they either finish or they fail. And along the way, they deny other possibilities. But narratives go on and on like a graceful dance with the world. And they embrace possibility. So I encourage you to weave graceful narratives in code and in life. Thank you very much.